The headlines on RT International. The U.S. reportedly considers military strikes against Syria's government as Washington says it is edging closer to conflict with Moscow. British national newspaper The Independent links Russian and Syrian forces to a shelling that killed a young champion swimmer and her brother in Aleppo, but fails to mention the attacks were targeting a government-controlled area. Also,
so you can go to hell. Mr. Obama, you can go to hell.
Yet more strong words leveled at Obama by the Philippine President as the country hosts war games with America, which Rodrigo Duterte hints may be the last while he's in power. Right now, turning midday in Moscow, you're watching RT International. From all of us here, thanks for joining us. Washington is considering military strikes against Syria's government, according to media reports citing U.S. government sources. That's after America severed talks with Russia over the Syrian peace process. The U.S. Secretary of State has once again blamed Washington's favorite scapegoat for the escalation in the conflict.
You also have the irresponsible and profoundly ill-advised decision by Russia to associate its interests and its reputation with that of Assad, a man who has been responsible for torturing 10,000 people, photographs of the victims, as well as perpetrating this extraordinary slaughter of his own people.
Well, the motto, Assad must go, has been a mainstay of the West's rhetoric. Now the White House says it understands potential attacks on President Assad's forces will bring Russia and the U.S. closer to conflict.
There's a risk associated with taking strikes at regime targets. That risk includes attacking a regime that does continue to maintain a robust air defense system. It also edges U.S. and Russian military forces closer to confrontation. It doesn't serve anybody's interest.
Well, America's decision to cut ties with Russia on ceasefire negotiations has hampered the peace process in Syria. Washington blamed Moscow for being ineffective in the fight against ISIL. In reaction, Russia said the U.S. appears ready to strike a deal with the devil to achieve its aims in Syria. And we asked the U.S. State Department what happens next as diplomacy gets put on the back burner.
I went to ask the State Department what led to the failure of diplomacy.
Didn't it fail after some rebel groups, specifically al-Sham in Aleppo, used the ceasefire to strengthen their positions? Didn't it fail after ISIL nearly took over Deir ez-Zor following the U.S. bombing of the Syrian military, admittedly by mistake? Did those things play no role in the failure of that deal?
There was a series of events, certainly the attack by mistake on Syrian forces, but then followed by the attack on the humanitarian convoy, and then subsequently by an increase in attacks on civilian targets in Aleppo. Look, we can talk all about the fact that some rebel groups or some opposition groups may have used the pause to resupply. That's a reality.
When questioned on the events that preceded the collapse of the deal, the State Department does concede, kind of half-heartedly, that the rebels had a role to play. But Washington's predominant narrative is that Russia and Assad suddenly rejected diplomacy and chose a military solution. Interesting that Secretary Kerry himself at one time argued for a military action against the Syrian government, as he told members of the Syrian opposition last week in a conversation that was leaked. He said he lost that argument and proceeded with President Obama's policy. On the question about whether everyone on the U.S. side was on the same page when negotiating the deal with Russia, here's what the State Department said today.
You said that the interagency process is very effective and creates a single policy. Isn't the idea once the president makes up his mind and decides on the policy that the dissenters shut up and don't complain publicly about?
Precisely. I mean,
did that happen in this case?
Again, on a policy and an issue as like Syria, I mean, you know, any given day, there's different elements and different dynamics to be considered. And I think that,
Okay.
you know, that always goes into, yes,
Did it create a single policy with no dissent?
yes.
Okay, it did? Because there were a lot of people complaining about it.
I understand that there's...
And not
I
not
understand that
secretly,
there's the
not
perception
the
of that.
whispering in the background.
I understand that there's a
Perception,
perception of that,
that's-
but what I would say is that,
Doesn't that compromise the effectiveness of this?
again, you know, we carried out the policy that the president had dictated.
Media reports now say the Obama administration is again considering military action. And we may, once again, see a divergence of views within the administration on how to proceed in Syria.
Experts we spoke to were also worried about the situation in Syria. James Carden from The Nation magazine said establishing a no-fly zone could be Washington's next move.
I think what's going to play out is that there's going to be a lot of pressure on the president to institute a no-fly zone or the so-called safe zones in northern Syria. That would put us on the road to a direct confrontation with the Russian Federation, Iran, and Syria. Because when you implement, say, a no-fly zone, you necessarily have to commit acts of war, and we know that there are Russian troops on the ground, and in the air there are Iranian troops on the ground, and the Syrian Air Force obviously has been very active in recent days. And so even the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff admitted before Congress that these things aren't so easy. It sounds easy to impose a no-fly zone. The reality is much different.
Meanwhile, on the ground, the Syrian conflict continues to claim more innocent lives. The University of Aleppo has been hit by a rocket attack carried out by rebel forces. And RT's Murad Gazdiev is in the embattled city right now, and he went to visit the injured.
It was a morning like any other. Classes had just finished and bored and tired students were making their way to dormitories. That's when the first of the shells hit Aleppo University.
The people of Aleppo are no strangers to shelling. They know to run for cover. Unfortunately, not everyone had the time.
One student, Majid, was unlucky enough to be caught in the first blast. This is where he was standing, and this is where the blood trail begins. We followed it all the way to the end. Obviously panicked, he tried to run away, tried to find cover. He ran behind this car and bled. They've covered most of it with sand, but Majid dropped his textbook here. He was a second-year student, and today was the last day of studies that he would ever have. He died a few hours after the attack.
We went to one of the hospitals to which victims of this attack had been taken. We wanted to speak to the survivors. This is 15-year-old Rama. She'd lost an eye.
I was standing when the explosion happened. I felt stunned and fell to my knees. I could feel something in my back. I collapsed, and some guys came and took me to the hospital.
In all, 5 students were killed today. 5 more in critical condition in hospital, and 17 have been released with minor injuries. Nevertheless, from the fact that almost all of the 11 blasts happened inside the campus of the university, tells us that this was a pre-planned attack and not the first time that rebels have targeted Aleppo University.